Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this panel session and following AGM. My name is Jeff Rempel. I'm the president of IAIA-WNC. That's the International Association for Impact Assessment, Western and Northern Canada, and we refer to ourselves as WNC. First off, I will provide a bit of an overview of our board and our association, IAIA-WNC. But first, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We, both the Canada West Foundation and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, Western and Northern Canada, board members live and work across Western and Northern Canada on lands that are home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Further to that, we do acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today here is a direct benefit of the policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. We both respect and affirm the rights of all Indigenous people across this land. And we really do. So our organization, IAIA-WNC, is a chapter of the larger IAIA, which is the world's leading professional association in the field of impact assessment. The WNC branch is a dynamic professional affiliate with members from federal, territorial consultancies, federal and territorial governments, consultancies, co-management boards, industry, and NGOs. We provide a range of impact assessment related activities for our members, including guest speakers, conferences, networking opportunities, and more. Our mission is to promote ecologically sustainable and equitable development, environmental justice, and the preservation of human rights. Membership to our organization is just $35 for a year. Many of our sessions are at a cost of $10 or more. And it also provides you with a discount to the larger conference, which is being held in Quebec this year. So with that, I'll pass things over to Ryan Workman from Canada West Foundation, who will be introducing the session and moderating it today. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Jeff. As Jeff said, my name is Ryan Workman. I'm a policy analyst at the Canada West Foundation. The Canada West Foundation is an independent, nonpartisan public policy think tank focused on the issues that shape life and prosperity in Western Canada. Our work has a single aim: unlocking the West's potential so it can power Canada's future. Before we start the webinar today, I just want to cover some technical details. Please note that participant cameras and chat functions will be turned off for the duration of the webinar. However, the QA option is open, so you can submit questions throughout the discussion. During the Q&A segment at the end, I will invite those who submitted questions to ask it on camera if you would like, or I can read the question out for you. You can also put your hand up if you would like to ask a question at the end and you did not submit it in the Q&A. The subject of this webinar is impact assessment. As part of its effort to turbocharge the Canadian economy, the federal government has stated its objective to build big, build bold, and build now. An essential part of this agenda is reforming impact assessment. But what is needed to streamline these processes? We have three panelists today who are going to talk about what changes would need to be made to the Canadian impact assessment to become a two-year process in line with federal objectives. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panel. If everyone could come on camera. So starting with Raymond, could you each please introduce yourselves?
Thank you. My camera on. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raymond Cardinal. I'm a member of the Sucker Creek First Nation in Northern Alberta. I'm currently the Indigenous co-chair for the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee for the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Thank you. Jessica?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Kennedy. I'm a partner at Bennett Jones, and I specialize in regulatory and environmental law, largely working for proponents seeking to navigate Canada's and the province's regulatory frameworks for project development, working in various sectors. Was privileged to work on the Trans Mountain Expansion Project as one notable experience for roughly 10 years. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. And last but not least, Elisabeth Gill.
Thank you. So Hi, everyone. My name is Elisabeth Gill. I'm the director of Quebec's regional office at the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. I've been in this position for 2 years now, and before becoming a director, I was team lead at the agency. So I am also one of the people currently working on the 2 years review of our impact assessment process. Nice meeting you.
Thank you. So we're going to spend the next 40 minutes discussing what Canada needs to do to bring its impact assessments down to a 2-year process. To start that conversation, I just want to start by defining the conversation a bit. So Elisabeth, could you give us a quick summary of how projects get approved in Canada?
Yes, of course. So from an IAAC perspective, impact assessments are a project planning tool used to identify potential adverse effects in federal jurisdiction of major projects in advance and to address those effects through project design and mitigation measures. They enable responsible development, increase investment certainty, help protect the environment, and uphold Indigenous rights as projects move forward. Federal impact assessment do not apply to all projects in Canada. They are limited to major projects that are likely to have adverse effects in federal jurisdiction, such as those with potential transboundary effects or adverse impacts on Indigenous people. Most other projects are assessed provincially or territorially.
So there's been a significant amount of criticism of the impact assessment process in recent years. Are these criticisms fair? And is there really a problem here? We can start with, this is a question for all the panelists, but we can start with Raymond.
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Ryan. I think for myself, I think there are issues that really do need to be addressed in the overall impact assessment space. But I do have questions about the way some of this narrative has unfolded. You know, one of the points that I make when I speak with First Nations communities is the fact that Canada's had a Red Tape Reduction Act since 2015. And there have been processes to work in this space for decades. You can go back to Prime Minister Stephen Harper or even before then, and lots of work has gone into red tape reduction and looking how to get these projects advanced. Where I see the challenge is a lot of times the issues are not necessarily regulatory burden, the issues are related to commercial interests, commodity prices, things of that nature that are holding back a lot of these projects from proceeding. I think overall, there are challenges. And Ryan, I would be averse if I didn't include, there are also specific challenges that First Nations and other Indigenous communities have in this space. And I think those are not really as visible as other issues. And I think these are issues that hopefully we can discuss as we go through the rest of this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm happy
Jessica
to
or Elisabeth?
weigh in, Ryan. So, is criticism of the process fair? Sure. I think a large hurdle that we face in this space is that perception is a big part of reality. So to the extent that there is a perception that our assessment framework in Canada is broken, it has a chilling effect at the outset with respect to international investment in our energy sector, critical minerals, and the like. So I think there's been some progress made, and we can talk about that in terms of that messaging. And then in terms of the mechanics of it all, the idea, to Raymond's point, of one project, one review, and regulatory reform has been around for as long as I'm aware. So there is sort of this issue we have in Canada with our constitutional division of powers, where we have provincial jurisdiction to regulate these large infrastructure projects, as well as federal areas of jurisdiction that overlaps on those same projects. And how we manage that has been the subject of litigation over many years, and we're still working to figure that out. I would say overall the impact assessments at the federal level have grown in the scope and the scale of them. That's reflected in the Act itself, which presents challenges when it comes to managing that overlap.
Okay, so I can jump in here. So I guess over the past several months, IAAC has been re-engineering our processes to complete our assessment in 2 years. There's been a lot of work that have been done. There's a launching of this 2 years process that is coming soon. And I guess that I want to flag all the progress that have been made in the last few months as well in terms of cooperation agreements. So reducing duplication with provinces with cooperation agreements have been advancing a lot. We have final agreements with BC for a long time, but new agreements with Alberta, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and we have draft agreement with Newfoundland and Labrador and Manitoba. So there's been a lot of work that have been done through several months, the few months ahead. So I think that the message here is that we are working into cooperation agreements, streamlining our processes, integrate permitting into IA process. This is something that has been undergoing for several months now. We are looking for an integrated process with permitting in 2 years for proponents that would want these timelines but would be ready as well. So this is something that has been on the table for several months. I wanted to flag that. And other than that, I want to flag that into our 2 years process. There's different approaches that are putting forward. For example, the key issues approach that we are putting into the 2 years in terms of trying to focus on what is important in terms of providing decision in 2 years. We need to change things in the process to make sure that we are focusing on what is important. And another thing that is really, really important into this process is Indigenous engagement early on in the process. This is something that we will put forward and share with proponents ahead of a project and make sure that we are all aligned into this new approach in terms of make sure that Indigenous groups are part of the process way before beginning the IA process and the permitting. So these are some key elements that we are considering into this new 2 years process model.
Thank you, everyone. Jessica, I have a question for you on the Major Projects Office. I just wanted to ask, what is your understanding of the Major Projects Office? What are they currently doing, and do they have a role in impact assessment?
Sure. So the Major Projects Office is largely aimed at coordinating the various different federal agencies and federal decision makers with respect to major infrastructure projects. In order to fall within this coordinating effort, a project has to be designated by Cabinet as being a priority project of national interest. And so there have been a handful of those projects so designated. I'd say largely the goal there is not as much on the impact assessment side, although I believe there is some early stage coordination there, but also to help get projects over the finish line if they do successfully complete the impact assessment process and it is found that the impacts are not significant, for instance, that they can then move ahead to get all the various permits in place. But, you know, if you think of a project like an LNG terminal, for instance, you've got, of course, the Impact Assessment Agency, but you also have Fisheries and Oceans Canada, you've got Transport Canada with respect to navigation, shipping safety, and the like. There's the Canadian Coast Guard, which has similar but different mandate. ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, they have species at risk concerns that they would look to have addressed there, and some permitting requirements potentially. Natural Resources Canada, obviously, on the natural resources side. So there's all these different federal roles that do have a legitimate and an important role to play on these major projects. And so the idea of this major projects office is to bring everybody together to perform sort of an coordination function to ensure that, at least on the federal side, things are running smoothly. What it doesn't do, at least not expressly, is coordinate between the federal decision makers and the provinces and the provincial agencies that may also have a role. And so, you know, to Elisabeth's point, there's been a lot of positive development in that regard with respect to coordination between the federal and provincial levels of oversight. But that is, I would say, largely separate from what's going on with this major projects office.
Thank you. And would I be correct in saying, when we're looking at reforming these impact assessment processes, in terms of delivering things within 2 years, there's a lot of other organizations and agencies and bodies that are involved in that? It's not just reform to impact assessment. Either Jessica or Elisabeth?
Yeah, I mean, happy to defer. Sorry to Elisabeth. I was just going to say that the impact assessment is sort of one piece, and then the permitting side generally follows after. And so when you talk about a 2-year time frame, you want to be clear on like what those 2 years are. Is it to get through an impact assessment, or is it impact assessment and also permitting? And, you know, Elisabeth can maybe speak to overall timelines on that and the expectations there, but they are sort of distinct phases.
Yeah, so in terms of integrated process, i.e. and permitting, we are looking with federal authorities to integrate these two. It's not two, it's depending on how many authorization we need, but we are looking for a decision, an IA decision, and maybe 30 days after looking for permitting decision. So these timelines are still depending on proponents. So there are different options that can occur for proponents. So we can still have an integrated process, but still we would have the decision on permitting 30 days after. We can have the concurrent permitting and IA process. We can manage the whole processes all together at the same time, but still wait for authorization later on if, in any case, proponents are not ready to provide the required information in time. So there are different scenarios, but we are now working on providing this possibility to enter into an integrated process in 2 years. This is what we are working on right now with federal authorities responsible for authorization.
Open it up to the whole panel again for the next question. Is reforming impact assessment into a 2-year process possible and reasonable? What would need to happen? So we've been talking about some of the reforms that are being considered. How long do you think it might take for us to get to your 2-year process? Is it reasonable and feasible with everything that impact assessments need to cover?
I can jump in here. I think there are a few key ingredients to success with this new approach. I think first, I would see a clear and well-defined project from the start. This is really important that proponents are ready to enter into a 2 years process and the project is well defined. I guess a clear and I just said that, early clarity on the issues that matter most. I touched on it previously, but the key issues approach is really important into a 2 years process. We don't have time to look at everything into a 2 years process. We need to work on what is important for participants, for Indigenous groups, and what are the most effects that we are expecting into this project. So we need to set the stage early in the process about that. We need also strong, respectful relationship with Indigenous groups. This is something that I touched earlier. This is key. A tailored Indigenous and public engagement strategy that fits the context, and confidence on our side about what regulators expect. So this is part of an integrated process. Proponents need to understand what are the requirements to enter into this process and know at the beginning if this is feasible in with the information available and that the proponent is able to provide if the 2 years process is possible. So these are, I think, that the key ingredients for success for the 2 years.
And would you like to weigh in?
Who? I can go next. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate the question. I think the question of whether it's reasonable or realistic, I think that really depends on the proponent and the specific type of project that people are going to be bringing forward. I think some of the early examples of projects that went to the major projects office, those were well-established, well-developed projects with a long track record of relationships with communities. And so they were building on a foundation of success already. So if you looked at LNG Canada and their second phase, they had already spent a decade or more working with the Haisla, and they were able to build up a strong relationship and see success on the first phase. And then looking at the second, I wonder if that's going to be the exact same path when you look at the Alberta proposal for a pipeline, because that doesn't necessarily have the same relationships or same foundations. There aren't the same understandings of how we want to work together. There are always questions around capacity when it comes to First Nations communities. One of the things that never gets talked about in this overall space, and this is something as a former consultation manager I can attest to, it was not unusual to see over 1,000 provincial notifications a year and to see an equal workload on the federal side, and all while having a staff of 2 people to try and manage this. And I think that this is going to be the real challenge where the rubber hits the road on whether this will work or not, working with Indigenous communities, because many of our communities are not large. They don't have staff of hundreds that can sit down and work on a brand new project today with nothing else on their agenda. It's going to be a big challenge. And when you start talking about impacts to rights, it becomes a question on how are you assessing those impacts? Who is assessing those impacts? And do we agree that something is significant or not? I mean, respectfully, we might have a list of 20 different issues in a community that are all equally important to different members of the community, whether they're leadership or elders or members. And making sure that those issues are addressed in a major project space does take time, and it does take resources. And, oftentimes the resources are stretched quite thin. I think if I look to the Arctic and some of the work that's done, I have seen examples, and Kate could speak to this later, but there are examples of models where you can see a yes be reached in less than 2 years. And so we know the model exists, but it's a question for me on how well Indigenous impacts are identified, how they're assessed, and how they're worked through, and do you have a strong enough relationship to come to an agreement on a proposal and then allow support for the project going forward? And I think the last piece that I wanted to mention today, depending on where you're holding these projects, there are First Nations and there is case law that do require free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous communities in this process. And can you achieve FPIC in this 2-year process? It's not just meeting and engaging and providing community lunches, it's actually working to achieve consent. And that is a different question and creates different expectations on the part of communities. So I'll just stop there for now. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
I don't know, Ryan, if I can follow up on Raymond's comments. I just want to flag that we are very conscious of these challenges, and in terms of the 2 years process, we want to provide funding for Indigenous groups to participate earlier than what it is now, just to make sure that they have the funding to participate. It doesn't address all these capacity issues that we know that some Indigenous groups are facing. But in terms of reducing the burden on consultation with Indigenous groups, we are trying and we are experiencing already Crown consultation coordination with federal departments, just to make sure that we reduce the burden. And as for some projects in the past, we've been having these consultation sessions by each department separately. So this is something that we are trying already to address and try to coordinate better. So just wanted to flag these items. And finally, I want to highlight that into this re-engineered process that we are thinking, we think about how many documents we are sharing into an impact assessment process with Indigenous groups, and how it is burdensome for some of them to revise this quantity of information into an IA process. So we are trying to change that a little bit and try to change the way we are doing things into have continuous relationship with the indigenous group, instead of sharing a lot of information and asking for comments on documents that are very voluminous. So this is something that we have thought about in terms of improving this this consultation process with Indigenous groups, but happy to hear your thoughts or comments about that.
So was that a question to Raymond, Elisabeth, or?
I can go. I was wondering if Jessica wanted to jump in. I didn't want to exclude her. So Jessica, if you wanted to go, or I can go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to the conversation. It's all, yeah, it all rings really true, including, from the proponent side of the experience going through these processes. I think, when we talk about 2-year times, to my point earlier, we're talking about the formal regulatory impact assessment timeline. I mean, Elisabeth will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's from when you file your initial project description. But there's a long path to get to that initial project description. And it does, to a great degree, depend on, the proponent, but also the nature of the activity, the location. So for instance, right now under the project list, federally, you've got natural gas fired generation facilities. And so with a lot of natural gas plant proposals coming forward in Alberta these days, those are all caught under that list. But a lot of them are on private land. They're, 100 or more kilometers away from the closest Indigenous community. They may have like local landowner and community engagement challenges or relationships and all of that process. But it would look quite different, I think, on the federal IA side for something like that than you have for example, an LNG terminal on the coast. So in terms of whether 2 years is feasible, I think it depends. Like, I think to sum up what we're all saying is it depends on that legwork on the front end to a great degree, and then also depends on the scope and scale of the assessment that the agency frankly decides to implement. Like, they will set their impact statement guidelines, and if those are narrow and focused on things like fisheries, then that makes it much more achievable than a full wholesome project review of a mine, for instance, which is very heavily regulated at the provincial level. So there's a lot of it depends sort of answer, but I think, again, to my earlier point, the signal is strong. I think the willingness at the federal level to work towards it appears to be strong, and so I think that gets us, at least halfway there.
I think, Ryan, the other part I would point out, depending on the type of project, I think that can have a significant bearing on the amount of time. If you were to take I think it was the Red Chris mine in Tahltan territory, you're consulting one community, and it's a community you've had a long-standing, decades-long relationship with. So the amount of time it would take to work through relationships, work through a consent-based agreement, that seems fairly not easy, but straightforward. You contrast that with, say, interprovincial pipelines, where you might be engaging 120 or 150 First Nations or Indigenous communities along the pipeline right away. The amount of time that takes to consult and engage and build relationships and get support, that does take time. And then when you're looking at that number of communities, then you're also looking at in some cases, high-performing First Nations that are able to consult and engage and be ready and able to be involved quickly. And in other cases, it might take considerable time, even just connecting with a community. And depending on the type of project and the level of information, I've seen, 25, 30,000 page mining applications. That takes time to work through. It takes a degree of technical ability that often doesn't exist within our communities. To review some of these documents, you practically need to be a mining engineer. And I don't know very many communities that have mining engineers working in community. And so some of these things will take time, and making sure that the level of information is presented in such a way that communities understand the work that's there, that they've got the resources to do what's needed. Do they need legal advice? Do they need specialized consultants like a mining engineer to review documents? Does the company have, adequate resources for their community relations and engagement? Because when you start dealing with hundreds of communities, the amount of time it takes to manage and coordinate all of this. I'm sure, Jessica, with your experience on Trans Mountain, you know what I'm talking about, that this can be quite the endeavor to work through. And is that realistic in a 2-year time frame? I would probably say not really. I think you need a little more lead time if you're meeting with that volume of communities to try and make sure you've established and built relationships in such a way that you're likely to get the support from communities. And I think resourcing, Elisabeth, to your question earlier, is a significant question. I've applied for federal funding for support for these types of projects, and you might spend several hours filling out a 20-page application for $10,000, which does nothing to really help build the capacity in community to manage the issues. And so I think a real revisit of what capacity support for Indigenous communities in this space really does need to go forward. I mean, you've got your standard model with all the projects and processes. I can be critical of provincial levels of funding at times, but at least there's provincial levels of funding that we can tie to that help build and grow capacity and maintain staff, train and develop staff to take on all these sorts of issues. Where when it comes to federal projects, oftentimes you might get I would call it a token amount of funding that allows you to, I guess, pay some bills, but it doesn't really allow you to build the capacity to respond in such a way that will allow you to work towards that. Yes, even if there's an agreement from both the community and the company, you still have to work towards building that consent. And the amount of time and resources that it takes, frankly, should be covered by the Crown and not relying on proponents to have resourcing to support communities. Communities, Jessica, are happy that they get capacity support from industry, but I think that part of the responsibility here rests with the Crown, federally and provincially, to make sure communities have adequate resources so that you have the time and resources, Ryan, to get in that 2-year time frame. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up. So part of what I'm hearing here, and also, so when I've had conversations with industry about impact assessment, what I generally hear is that the uncertainty is a big factor about what the timeframes will be. And then, Elisabeth, you're saying that an important part is being properly prepared when they come in. Uh, and uh, over to what Jessica was saying earlier about the perception of Canadian approval processes. Is there work being done to, or is there ways that we can make industry more prepared when they're coming into these processes? Is there work being done on that front? And um, is there ways to give them realistic timelines if they're coming in with a project where 2 years is possibly not feasible, that they can know, be aware up front of the complexities and the potential timelines?
Yeah, so IAAC is currently working on some guidance for and tools for proponent to prepare for this 2 years. So this is something that we are really engaged in to make sure that proponents are ready. So we are there to support them to be ready. So this is something that we are currently working on. So they will be provided with some guidance, and we will provide support in terms of a list of consultation, Indigenous consultation, for example, if they didn't engage in any meetings with the Indigenous group, we can provide this kind of support to them. So yeah, in terms of trying to having this conversation with each proponent in terms of as if they are ready or not, we are I think we are engaged into trying to reflect the timelines that we are engaging on each side into the decision making. So we are going to share, and we already did for some project, a standard timelines, or I'm looking for the word and I just only have it in French, but it's a kind of a project charter that we would convene with each proponent, that we would put on our registry, and we can track the timelines there and see if there are some delays. So in terms of predictability and knowing where we are going and what are the next steps, this is something that is going to improve transparency and predictability as well. So everyone, the public and the participant, will be able to see where we are at. So these are some things that are going to be helping, I think, proponents to have a better sense of predictability and knowing where we are at in the advancement of the process.
Jessica or Raymond, do either of you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think one of the misnomers I've seen in the overall discussion around streamlining and red tape reduction. I mean, Canada, the federal government, and previously Natural Resources Canada played a concierge role in supporting industry. So if I was proposing a major project, I could meet with this concierge support, and they could walk me through the regulatory process and identify issues and identify areas so that I could be developed. And so, this is one of my challenges when I listen to these debates, because Canada has already been doing that, and they've been doing that for a decade. How well, I guess, is maybe a different question. Are they doing it well enough? I think we can ask that and should ask that. I think for me, though, when I listen to all these discussions, it's also, Ryan, reflects back on how are we supporting Indigenous communities to participate and understand where all the places they're going to be consulted on and engaged, and what sort of concierge support do we provide First Nations? And right now, the answer is none. We don't provide any support to Indigenous communities. We give them a small token amount of funding and very little support on all of the steps on what these major projects will look like and all the places they're going to need to provide advice and provide feedback and potentially, hopefully, be giving their consent. And that does require a greater level of sophistication than what we've seen previously. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
I guess what I can share on this sort of the front end exploration phase of these projects, the whole topic around Indigenous consultation and the legal framework and the regulatory overlay on that is a key area of sort of question and concern for international investment and partnerships looking to sort of enter the Canadian space without that institutional background, because it is quite different and unique to Canada. And so we get a lot of questions on it, and a lot of, desire to pinpoint the risk and to find a path to eliminate the risk, which is, the sort of business speak for really what turns out to be much more nuanced conversation about building relationships and, working with local experienced advisors when it comes to sort of getting off the ground on a new project concept, because it's tough to walk in a cold, having never developed a project in Canada, to meet these communities for the first time. And so, having those strategic partnerships or advisors at your fingertips is crucial to sort of getting some momentum to work towards a successful project, because it really is crucial. It kind of matters not what your major project is. Indigenous consultation is key across the country.
Thank you. We have 15 minutes left, so I do have more questions that I could ask, but before that, I am going to open it up if any of the audience would like to submit questions. I do see that there's two in the Q&A, but I think both of them, unless Victoria, you want to comment, I think they're both more comments than questions. But I do see, if anyone would like to ask a question live, then put up your hand, which I believe that there are some yes there. Timothy, would you like to ask your question on camera, or should I ask it for you? Not hearing a response there, I'll read the question out. Timothy asks, where can we get information on how Indigenous-led projects are taxed and how the benefits from those projects contribute financially to Canada as a whole, not just Indigenous communities compared with non-Indigenous-led projects? If anyone has anything on that question.
I'm not sure. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, Ryan.
So the question is, where can we get information on the taxation of Indigenous-led projects? I don't know. I assume that there's project registries where you can see major projects. There's the impact assessments. You can see projects that have been submitted and are being reviewed there. And whether or not, sorry, now I'm answering the question, but if anyone else would like to weigh in on it. But I think, I mean, part of the answer is that you can find major project submissions online.
And if I understood correctly, there's taxation in the question.
Yes, is there tax? Just I mean, I guess that would be a question for Elisabeth about taxation information available on major projects.
We don't have this information. I'm sorry. I don't think it's available neither. Yeah, so sorry about that. I can follow up if I can after the session. I don't know if others have any insight about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question is kind of hinting at like maybe some sort of study that would compare, the taxation paid by Indigenous led projects versus those in the private sector, and where those funds go. But I'm not aware of any such study. And, being involved in project development on the legal side, I will say like the tax analysis is very heavy by both like legal and financial advisors to establish corporate structures that work for whatever the arrangement is in a particular project from a tax perspective. And so, I'd be surprised if there was sort of a registry that lists all the taxes paid for each project, for instance.
Got a couple of questions here for Raymond. Raymond, can you see the Q&A?
I can't. Just on that last question though, Ryan,
Yeah.
when I look at that, I think I haven't seen any actual studies on those sorts of projects, so I don't know if there is data that we can just freely share. When it comes to those projects benefiting Canada as a whole, I mean, if we took one of the LNG projects that are Indigenous led, those projects are going to be built in Canada. There's going to be revenues flowing from all of those, and I'm sure the communities will benefit from those projects more than more than non-Indigenous led projects. But I think for me, the comment is always that, we are going to then take those revenues. So when I earn a revenue, I spend it here in Canada, and so it's part of the Canadian economy. It doesn't go to some offshore tax shelter that leaves the country and never benefits anyone but our communities. I think that this is something that's a bit of a misnomer, and I think First Nations projects are run by businesses, and I would expect that they have all of the tax requirements and all the tax benefits that are out there for other projects. So I would expect that it's really no different than other projects. But I can look at the other Q&A questions now. Okay. Did you have a specific one in mind, Ryan?
I'm just working down the list. There's one that says you made an excellent point. So it mostly
okay.
reiterates your
Thank you.
point, but it says good point on the concierge service for First Nations communities. Then the next one is how can communities feel more supported if money in the form of capacity agreements are not enough? So I think the question is what additional supports might be needed in addition to financial support, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, Kevin?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's actually something I spent a lot of time thinking about. I think, how are we supporting communities? In some cases, it could be money and resourcing. In other cases, um, I think it's a question to me around training. How are we training and supporting Indigenous communities on a whole host of issues? You might see some really highly technical issues, and how are communities weighing through those items? I've been in regulatory engagements where regulators speak in plain language and spend a lot of time crafting their communications so that it is transparent and accessible, and you can understand and be involved in the dialogue. And in other regulatory engagements, they might as well be speaking a foreign language because people don't understand what's being discussed. And so I think communication is a really big question item. The use of plain language, I think, is really important. Time is a big item that really needs to be recognized. If you are going to consult an individual in a consultation office, how much time do they have to support these discussions? If you are meeting with leadership, or can you just show up at a band office, Ryan, and sit down with chief and council because they've got nothing else to do but wait for you? That seems to be the attitude at times, and really that's not fair. Making sure that you're creating the space, and if you're working on a project that requires the involvement of the entire community, how are you managing that and presenting information in such a way that's critical? And if there are technical items, how are we making sure that people are aware of the different technical issues that are there? And I think for me, in the longer term, where is the training and support? There are courses and degree programs for impact assessment, but very few of them are available in Western Canada, and very few of them still look at Indigenous impacts. And so, where are we training and developing folks to participate in these kind of dialogues? Where are we training folks for a whole host of different types of issues that are there? Because if I was going to send a monitor to an active construction area or an active production area, there are specific safety risks that need to be assessed. And how are we training people on all these different areas? I think the issue for me is really putting a really strong emphasis on training and support, putting a strong emphasis on communications, appreciating that some of these issues are perceived differently and looked at. To Jessica's point around international investors, they'll look at issues from their standard lens, and there needs to be an appreciation that some Indigenous issues are focused or looked at quite a bit differently. And how do you make sure that those issues are properly addressed? I made this point in other settings, but Canada and the EU are looking at building stronger trade and business relationships right now. But those EU businesses really don't have a framework on how they were supposed to respect Indigenous rights. So what are we doing to support those businesses to understand Indigenous rights? What are we doing to support Indigenous communities to understand the industry that's coming in and wanting, hopefully, potentially to partner and work with them in the long term? So there's a lot of items there that require time and training and education to move this along. So I'll just stop there for now. Thanks.
The
jump
next
in
question.
if
Sorry.
sorry, I just wanted to complete with this question, but if we don't have time, that's fine. We can go to the other question. That's fine.
No, there's a lot of questions on this subject, so I think we can spend a bit more time on it.
Okay, so just wanted to flag that I spoke about the funding available, and I didn't talk about capacity funding program that is available at the agency as well. But I agree that funding is not the only way. I think we need to work with proponents to make sure that they communicate well these impact studies, that they are able to provide the information about how these effects are impacting their in relation to key issues that are identified. I think that this is something in the communication side of things. I really agree with Raymond about that. And we are, maybe AI can help in that manner to help communicate these impact studies that are very voluminous and technical. Maybe there are some ways to use AI in that sense. But again, training is another tool that we can explore. But in the meantime, I agree with the training part of things. But in the meantime, if we are changing the approach and the way we used to do things in a different way, just focusing on key issues and what is important for Indigenous group, I think we can maybe get away from too technical information and focus on what is important. I think this is something that we can change in our approach.
And I think we have time for one more question. We had another one related to the concierge support, but I think we've covered that topic in the time we have. So there's a question for you, Elisabeth. What examples could IAAC share on how they will be reducing the documentation and information requirements, for example, through scoping of non-federal effects or through alternative forms of documentation? I think this will need to be our last question. You're on mute. Sorry.
So example on how we would reduce information requirements. It is the question. Yeah, so in terms of, for example, in the planning phase, really concrete, we used to ask Indigenous groups and the public to comment on tailored impact statement guidelines and plans. We need to provide 4 plans according to the Act. And we were asking for comments on these plans and on these voluminous guidelines that we used to publish. Now they are more tailored, but we used to have voluminous guidelines. So this is something that we wouldn't ask anymore. We would work maybe on differently with Indigenous group, as I said, with the key issues identification and resolution, finding solutions to problems. So this is something that would be different. And in terms of information and studies, as I said earlier, we wouldn't, we would try to work with proponents to provide the information as soon as ready without asking them to provide a whole impact study at the end of the timelines. So that way, we could work with information that is not really in the same format as an impact study, for example, and we could be more flexible in terms of the information shared and then reduce maybe the number of documents that are shared if we are more focused on what is important on federal effects, key issues, identification and resolution. So this is something that would maybe lower the information requirements from an IAAC perspective.
I mean, I just wanted to share, we haven't talked a lot about it, but, you know, I'm joining here from Calgary, and the recent finalization of a cooperation agreement on impact assessment was frankly a huge milestone as between Alberta in particular and the federal government. And, you know, with the comments about trying to refocus federal assessment on what matters and not necessarily the format of information, but more the content and the key issues, I think is going to make a material difference. Just by way of example, we had a client pursuing a mining project, and they had a quote from an environmental consultant to prepare a federal project description. And this project had already been through, you know, the early stages of provincial processes. So they already had a bunch of environmental information and project documents and the like. But the quote to prepare the project description alone was $200,000. And that's just a foot in the door to have conversations with IAAC about whether you even need an impact assessment or not. And so, you know, those are data points that aren't really out there in the public realm, but I think it's important to understand that it's not, you know, there's these sort of broad concepts and ideas of like, we just want to see what your project is about, and then we'll let you know before you get too far down the road. Well, let's be a little bit looser with how you present that information to us. Like, you know, I mentioned natural gas power plants. Those are heavily regulated provincially, and why we couldn't just provide that same application material to the federal government to say, look, here's what we're doing. Here's a bunch of information and detail about this project. Can you confirm that we don't need a full impact assessment, you know, to avoid the need for more consultants, more reports, more time, delay, and money. And that's exactly what is written into that cooperation agreement is, you know, let's rely on what's already the hard work that's already been done at the provincial level. So I think this is all positive, and you know, these are sort of easy wins I see. So it's good to see it moving in that direction.
Yeah, Ryan, if you don't mind me commenting on this one, I think the question for me is it's nice that all these cooperation agreements are being signed now in the last year or so. For a long time, there was only the one. And, but the practical question for me is how well, there's a principle that exists at the federal level around regulatory coordination and cooperation. And the question is, it's nice to have an agreement that says we will work this way going forward. The question is, have you done the hard work that integrates everything? Because it makes it sound like everything is this perfectly intersecting Lego set that everything connects together and works well seamlessly. Whereas I've never seen cooperation, even at the federal level, between departments, that things work seamlessly together. And I think more work in terms of design and actually pushing that coordination and implementation of these agreements will bring to light future issues that will need to be addressed going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I am going to have to call the conversation there. We have reached time, but I do want to thank you all for being excellent panelists today. Thank you for sharing your time. Thank you to the audience for joining us today and joining us for this important conversation. So that's going to conclude the webinar portion of this, but I am going to hand the control back over to Jeff, who is going to talk about the IAIA-WNC annual general meeting. So thank you all for joining, and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. And thank you to our panelists. It's been a really great conversation. Jessica, Elisabeth, and Raymond, really appreciate your time here today.